Hi, Men's Community. We're back again with another YouTube episode with the Merrimack Institute for New Teacher Support at Merrimack College. Today, we are joined by Dr. Laura Hsu. Dr. Laura Hsu is an associate professor and program director of the Human Development and Human Services program in Merrimack College's School of Education and Social Policy. She teaches a course called Introduction to Human Development and a course called Diversity, Social Justice, and Ethics to pre-service teachers and students pursuing human services careers. One of her research interests include how more diverse and inclusive curricular materials can be incorporated into classrooms. We are so happy to learn from you today, and we're so happy to have you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you so much. I am so honored to be here, and I appreciate the time that you're taking with me today and for others who are watching this.
Absolutely.
So,
And whenever you're ready, you can please feel free to share your screen, and we'll get right started.
okay, excellent. So, are you able to see this?
Yes, we are.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Okay, so the title of my talk is Children's Books as Prisms, Selecting and Facilitating Conversations on Children's Literature. And before and as I was preparing for this talk, I watched Dr. Shannon Butler-McCorrow's wonderful Mints talk on developing cultural proficiency and cultural humility. And I was really inspired by a lot of the words of wisdom that she imparted. In particular, she talked about 5 essential elements of attaining cultural proficiency, or I should say working towards, because it's a constantly developing and evolving process. And there were 2 in particular that I feel that this talk really kind of fall under. The second principle that she outlined was claiming the differences and valuing diversity and celebrating diversity. And as a school, explicitly acknowledging and committing to incorporating more representative curricular materials into the classroom in the school. And the 5th was change for difference and making that active effort. So, 2 sort of precedes number 5 in terms of that commitment. But I just really wanted to mention how much her talk really sort of informed mine and how I think that there could be a good connection there. And I also want to acknowledge that Merrimack College was settled on the indigenous land of the Pennacook and Abenaki nations, because I feel it's important to acknowledge that acknowledge the land that we're speaking on.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure. I also want to mention my dear colleague Divya Anand, who is also a part-time instructor at Merrimack College teaching our diversity and practice upper level course for undergraduates. And she's the founder and CEO of Gaia Connections, which is a consulting business in helping government agencies, institutions of higher ed, K through 12 schools to really promote equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so I provided her information if any of you want to reach out. I'm honored to be one of her advisory members, and I work very closely with her, and also am very inspired and influenced by her work in terms of what I convey in this talk. So the outline for my talk is that I'm first going to provide demographic information on the publication industry for children's books, followed by a discussion of the disparity of public school teachers of color relative to their students, and thereafter emphasize the importance of selecting books that are mirrors, windows, sliding glass doors, and prisms for all children, and offer tips for selecting children's books for classes or home. And I also want to introduce a method of reading called diffractive reading, which kind of goes with the prism metaphor that I'm going to mention before that, and then give an example of a children's book and questions that illustrate a diffractive reading approach. So this is a series of pie graphs showing diversity in publishing in 2019, and the source is Lee and Low Books. And as you can see, the industry is primarily comprised of individuals who represent privileged and dominant identities, such as white, cis, mostly women, straight individuals, and non-disabled or able-bodied individuals. And so when you think about who comprises the publishing industry, and you think about the types of books that are published and the choices of who's making those decisions, it often is a direct reflection of who is making those decisions. So when we then look at diversity in children's books, and this is from a year earlier, which is the most recent picture that we could find with these statistics, we can see that it is sort of a direct reflection, or I should say lack thereof, of reflecting back to underrepresented individuals, to BIPOC or Black, Indigenous, people of color. So in this instance, we're talking about children's books, but as you can see, American Indians, First Nations, only 1% of books published in 2018 are really reflected back to children who identify as American Indian or First Nation, Latinx 5%, Asian Pacific Islander, Asian Pacific American 7%, African American 10%. So as you can see, animals and other other living beings or objects are represented more than the other populations combined of BIPOC children. And perhaps not surprisingly, 50% of books that were published in 2018 were of white children. When we think about public education settings, and this was also mentioned by Dr. McCorrow, there is a disparity in the demographics of the teachers and their students. So these statistics are from 2015, but as you can see, the vast majority of teachers tend to be white. They also tend to be females, in contrast or in proportion to the students that they teach. So when we think about who chooses what books are published, we think about the publishing industries, who's making those decisions, but also teachers have a lot of autonomy in determining what books they choose for their classrooms or what books parents decide to have in their homes. So therefore, it's really important for books to represent not only the people that are being read to or who are reading the books, but it's also important even for, say, white children, to learn about other identities. It's sort of doing them a disservice as well by not having a wide range of representative identities. So Bishop is very well known for coming up with this metaphor of books being mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors. So they're mirrors because they sometimes reflect back to us if we can see ourselves in the book, whether it's the same race or nationality or sexual orientation or gender identity or religion or immigration status. They can also be windows that we look through at other people's lives, offering views of worlds that may be real or imagined, familiar or strange. And these windows could also be sliding glass doors. And as Bishop says, readers have only to walk through an imagination to become part of whatever world has been created or recreated by the author. So these are really wonderful metaphors to think about when choosing books, and not just based on representation of students in the class, although that's certainly something to consider, but just how can we all have more inclusive curricular materials. Recently, Krishna Swami last year wrote a blog article on building upon Bishop's metaphorical framework, saying, yes, absolutely, books are mirrors and windows and sliding doors, but they're also like prisms. And when you think about how prisms work, they slow and bend light that pass through it, and they split that light into its component colors. And it can refract light in as many directions as the prism's shape and surface planes allow. And in the same way, books can disrupt and challenge ideas about diversity through multifaceted and intersecting identities, settings, cultural contexts, and histories. They can make us question the assumptions and practices of our own real world. So when we think about identity and how it's portrayed in books, it might not just be that one character's race is salient, but simultaneously the author might be foregrounding their gender. And so incorporating conversations about these intersecting identities and how complex we are as human beings is important and more often reflects reality. There was a research study that was done by Verhagen and colleagues where they looked at the paired association of words and also descriptors of people. So they had descriptors like black, old, young, male, female, white, and they had concepts like poor, fragile, weak. And what they did is they had participants come into the lab and look at a computer screen. And one by one, there was a pair of words that was shown. Actually, it was one word shown first, like black. And then afterwards, there would be another word such as poor. And they wanted participants to hit a button as soon as they felt there was an association between those words. Perhaps not surprisingly, they found that the participants paired and associated the words more quickly. The reaction time was more quick to associate certain word pairings over others. And this is just an example of some of the correlations that they found between some word pairs. And by scanning this list, you'll probably notice it's not a surprise. And what they basically said that, you know, this came from is that we're all part of the same, a lot of us are influenced by the same forces socially. Now, some of us did not grow up in the same country, but nevertheless, a lot of us are still exposed to similar media, to similar TV shows, similar books. And over time, a lot of us develop these associations in our minds as a result of our exposure, our common exposure to a lot of these associations. So when you think about books, and you think about children's books in particular, and how at a young age, these associations can form and children are impressionable, we have control and we have the, you know, we have the power, so to speak, to make those decisions about what they are reading and how they're reading it. And what they're reading, how they're reading it is just as important as what they're reading. And I'll talk about that shortly. So on the next two slides, I'm just going to provide some questions to think about as you're selecting books, whether it's for your classroom or for your home. We already talked about the metaphor of mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors. So the first question is, what is the ratio of mirrors and window books that are on your shelf? And so when you think about the students in your class, or you just in general thinking about wide representation, is there enough of a variety? And so, because we want students to be able to have things that reflect back to them, and also other cultures and other forms of identity that they can learn about. Second, how many books are representative of people different from the child or children in your care? So I already alluded to that, but just making sure you're not basing decisions on who's in your company. Third, what are the various identities featured? For example, race, gender, disabilities, religion, nationalities, poverty, etc. You want a wide swath of not just in terms of race when we think of that. So it would be great to have books on, you know, American Indian identities, Asian, Latinx, Black, etc. But also we want to think about all aspects of diversity. Fourth, are the books developmentally appropriate for the age group? And oftentimes there is a guide when you're purchasing books about what age group it's appropriate for, but it's often subjective as well. And so, you know, I encourage you to preview the book on YouTube. There's actually a lot of free viewings of books being read, as some of you might already know. So you can sort of gauge if it's appropriate for the age group that you're teaching or not. And finally, what voice is central to the plot? Which characters are on the sidelines? Does it tend to be more privileged identities that are at the center? And if so, how are they foregrounded? It's very automatic for us to have seen a lot of children's books with white characters, cisgender characters, able-bodied characters. So it takes a conscious step back to think about what books are not foregrounding those identities. And I have a few more questions to think about as you're selecting books. Next, are the author and the illustrator able to speak to the experience depicted in the story? Or does the story seem to be written by an outsider looking in? So in my research, I've come across, books that were written about, say, an African-American family by a white male, and not that that necessarily invalidates how effective and poignant this story is, but we also want to make sure that we include books, by Black, Indigenous people of color, for Black, Indigenous people of color. And this hashtag own voices is now becoming more common, that it's ideal in many instances to look for books that are actually written from the perspective of a character in the book that identifies, that the author basically has a lived experience to tell. And that way we know it's authentic, and it just kind of empowers that community to give them more of a voice and representation, and know that it's coming directly, from that community. Next, is the book's message essentially we're all different but the same, without acknowledging or addressing how these differences may mean inequitable and disparate experiences for different people, and that the conditions that create those inequities still persist? The colorblind mentality is really counterproductive to trying to achieve, this cultural proficiency that Dr. McCarroll talked about. We really need to recognize difference. That's what equity is versus equality, and recognize where differences are imbalanced and try to address those inequities. And as she mentioned, celebrate those differences, acknowledge that, they have something unique to contribute, instead of sort of diluting them. Next, does the book in any way depict inclusion as going out of the way to make changes or accommodations for a particular character? Does it almost seem sort of burdensome to do that, and that we're altering the norm, we're just making an exception for this person, rather than really undermining the status quo and the structure that needs to be changed? The whole foundation needs to be sort of undermined and reestablished in order to accommodate and create a truly more inclusive environment. And then finally, do the illustrations in the book contain stereotypical images or caricatures? For example, exaggerated features of characters. Children tend to look, especially young children, look at a lot more at the illustrations than the words. Some of them, haven't learned to read quite yet, although they're starting to make those associations. But, sometimes as adults, including myself, we sort of forget that. And we're reading the book, so we're really focused on the words. But meanwhile, they're almost watching it like a movie that's being narrated. So the illustrations are just as important as the words, if not more so. And so it's important when you're choosing books to just notice the illustrations as well, and how they're depicting different groups of people. So when I talked about a prism earlier, I talked about how it can refract light and go in these different directions. And I talked a little bit about intersecting identities. So diffractive reading it sort of helps illuminate differences as they emerge, and how they get made, and what gets excluded, and how these exclusions matter. And I think you've kind of gathered this already through what I've already discussed. But it also looks at particular historical context, socio-historical contexts, and doesn't necessarily take the reading as is. So although it looks at things in a particular socio-historical context, it can also step out of it and say, okay, this is language that was used back then. It's maybe considered offensive now, but it's important to understand why it was used back then. And furthermore, how were people treated back then too, when that language was being used? It also does really emphasize these intersectional identities, and acknowledging that at any given time, one identity can be more salient than the other, but they still exist and manifest in unique ways. It places the teacher at the center of the educational experience through self-reflection. So it allows for transformative shifts in pedagogy. So the teacher or the parent's role is very, very important here in mediating those understandings with the child. And as Cheryl Hill pointed out in her article on diffractive reading, she says teachers can be anchored as nomadic entities in order to embrace a fluid and emergent sense of self, embrace difference and interference while setting up pedagogical camps from time to time and returning to familiar routes on a regular basis. It allows for binaries of student-teacher to be disrupted and position them both with equal agency as interacting bodies that foster co-learning. And the co-learning is really key here, and that the dynamic conversation between the teacher and the student or the parent and the child is really sort of a synergy of understanding of what's happening. So my colleague Divya Anandanai, I mentioned Divya earlier in the video, we developed a questionnaire intended for educators and parents and caretakers for selecting books and facilitating discussions on various aspects of identity. And I'm going to share that with Amanda, and she can attach it below the video so that you can all have access to it.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you, Amanda. And so as you're all reading through the questionnaire, we just want to emphasize that there might be multiple identities that are salient or not in any given context, just as I mentioned before. So you might want to use a combination of some of the questions in different categories, that context is important, as I've alluded to before, and that it's evolving. You know, as with many aspects of equity and social justice, the process of asking critical questions and gaining insights is open-ended and time and context dependent. And I just want to show you what the questionnaire looks like, just so you all can sort of recognize it. We have a note at the beginning, which is just what I described in that slide that you saw. But we have some general questions that just sort of help guide your general introduction into whether a book, you might want to consider having a book on your shelf. And then we break it up into different categories. So poverty and socioeconomic status, religion, ethnicity and culture, race, hair diversity, immigrant status, language diversity, disabilities, gender, sexual orientation, family composition, and allyship. So it's fairly comprehensive, and we're still adding to it. And we hope that it'll be a helpful guide for all of you. So I just want to give one example of how diffractive reading can be used with one book, which is I Am Jazz. And some of you might be familiar with this book. It's written by Jessica Herthel and Jazz Jennings herself. So this is sort of an autobiographical children's book. Jazz Jennings transitioned from a male to a female. And this was written in 2014. And Jazz also had her own reality show, I believe on TLC. So she's a public figure. And the questions that we have in our questionnaire around gender are these. Does the book serve to neutralize the pressure to conform to particular gender identities aligning with accepted gender expressions? What genders are normalized in the book and accepted? How would the book impact the child who does not identify along the traditional gender binary or the gender depicted in the book? And do the characters depicted in the book conform to or break off from traditional gender roles? So while I Am Jazz positively models the transition of jazz from male to female with the support of family and friends, it does inadvertently stereotype gender roles and expressions along a binary, unless there's a critical conversation about how the story is particular to Jazz's experience as a transgender child. The visibility of transgender people in the media is largely due to the specific fact that they're celebrities, as much as they identify as trans, which includes Jazz Jennings, Laverne Cox, Caitlyn Jenner. So the book, while it speaks of the trans experience, it reaffirms gendered binaries with lines such as Jazz having a boy body in a girl brain, and liking pink, singing, makeup, dress up, and mermaids. And given that the story centers a transgender child and can lead to conversations about being gender creative, the unlearning of gender norms is even more critical than the learning of anti-bias concepts. So we hope that the questions that we have in the questionnaire will sort of prompt these thoughts as you're reading the book. And I was honored to work with the honor students last year in my diversity, social justice, and ethics class on diversity book kits. And our honor students chose a particular topic of diversity. I had one student actually in the spring, choose the topic of transgender identity. And for the book, she came up with a series of questions. Her name is Taylor Jacks. She came up with a series of questions that Divya and I then reviewed and helped, to shape these questions. And I won't read all of these, but I just want you to all glance at these and just notice how some of these questions might prompt critical thinking in children to think about the gender binary and to think about whether there's a pressure or there's a sort of normalization of a certain gender identity and gender expression in the book, and how comfortable or uncomfortable Jazz may have been, if she didn't reveal that she was transgender. And so this is just a sampling of questions that you could develop over time to try to, induce that critical social consciousness that we're hoping to instill. So to conclude, it's important to include children's books that feature underrepresented identities because they affirm the identities of children who identify with those identities, but also to raise awareness among children with privileged identities about other realities. And the books we choose are important, but the conversations we have around them are equally important. And a diffractive lens proposes an adult mediates understanding between the book and the child, recognizing that there are nuances that should gradually come to light. And I have some references here that you could refer to that I've cited earlier in the presentation. And if you'd like to contact me, this is my contact information, or of my colleague Divya. She runs workshops with a lot of schools, and I'm running a workshop with her at a family network organization at the end of this month on reading children's books. So we would be happy to connect with any of you. Thank you so much for this time.
That's so awesome. I will definitely add all of, it just knocked me out. I'm sorry. I was just saying that I will definitely add all of those. I could even maybe add some of those resources in the description below. I can add the contact information in the description below. But that was so amazing. Thank you for sharing all of that. I love the visuals. It was my first time hearing, I wrote it down, the mirrors, windows, sliding doors. I just think that all of that will really stick now. And even with the Jazz example, and I was in, for those who don't know, I was in Dr. Shu's diversity, social justice, and ethics class, but I don't remember that assignment. Is that new? Is that a new assignment?
New. We've done it for 2 years now, so I'm sorry you missed it.
I know, I just missed it.
I'd love for you to do it if you want to. But Amanda was an amazing student, as you can all imagine.
Oh, thank you. Well, yeah, I know, that was great. And we can't wait till you're back in the hallway. She's usually right across the hall from me. If I were to yell loud enough, and if she was in her office, she would be hearing me right now. But we're now back on campus. You could probably see that my background is a little different. And I was on mute. We have some construction going on outside. So anyway, so those are some Merrimack updates. Campus is looking a little different. We miss all of our Men's community members coming onto campus for our in-person workshops, but I do want to let you know that we do have a fall workshop lineup coming out soon, and those will all be taking place on Zoom. So it won't be on campus, but in the meantime, we will definitely be sending you some PD opportunities that you could do in the comfort of your own home. So please keep an eye out for that. And in the meantime, yeah, if you have any questions, please reach out to mints@merrimack.edu. And that is an email that I monitor. And yeah, if you have anything that you'd like to bring up with Dr. Shu, she's always responsive. So definitely let us know. And I don't know if you have any last words, or if you're all set, we can conclude this.
I just want to thank everyone for watching, and as Amanda said, encourage you to get in touch with us if you have any questions or want further resources. We're happy to help, especially in this time of remote learning. There are some creative things that you can do, so we'd be happy to help you with that.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Well, until next time, everybody, have a great day. Bye.